Hello, Blake Rudis here with F64 Academy and F64 Elite, and today I'm going to give you a 4-part series for the new Adobe Camera Raw 12.3. Now, there's a main reason why I'm doing this. I've been receiving a ton of comments and questions about the new ACR. And the video that I did last week, while it was good, it wasn't a comprehensive look at Adobe Camera Raw 12.3. So what I've done is I've taken day 4 of the 30 Days to Photoshop Mastery course that I just completed, and I've revamped it for the new Adobe Camera Raw 12.3. Well, that video in the series ended up coming out to be a little bit over an hour long. Now, I'm not gonna post an hour-long video here on YouTube, so what I've done is I've broken up that one video into 4 different parts so that you can watch all of those parts right here on YouTube and get better acquainted with Adobe Camera Raw 12.3. Now, if you like the way I've done this tutorial and you want to see the full 30 Days to Photoshop Mastery course, I'm gonna have a link in the card above, and I'm also going to have a link in the description below if you're interested in joining our 30 Day to Photoshop Mastery Challenge. So without further ado, I'm gonna jump into our first part here. And in this part, we're gonna be discussing workflow options, Adobe Camera Raw preferences, the crop tool, the spot healing tool, some miscellaneous tools that you're gonna see in Adobe Camera Raw, and how to save images in the new Adobe Camera Raw 12.3. All of the parts to this little video series are going to be in the description below as well, so you can navigate from part 1 to part 2 to part 3 to part 4. All right, you can watch them at your own pace if you'd like. Without further ado, let's jump in. So we're going to take a deep dive into Adobe Camera Raw, specifically into the workflow, the workspace, and the global tools. Now, it's really important to get a good grasp on this because Adobe Camera Raw is the foundational basis for everything that you're going to be doing in Photoshop, okay? What you do here starts everything else. I have this phrase, crap in, crap out, okay? So if you don't do things right in Adobe Camera Raw, guess what? It's not going to look good in Photoshop. You don't want to be chasing your tail trying to fix things in Photoshop that you didn't do correctly in Adobe Camera Raw. So experimentation with this one today is going to be really critical, and making sure that you do your homework on this and you don't just practice on my images, but you practice on your own, absolutely critical. And you're going to have this nailed down. So what I'm going to do here is I'm in Bridge right now. I've got 2 of the exact same carbon copy here. You don't have to open both of these. I'm just opening both of them so I can show you what the interface looks like. You might actually only have one of these actually. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to say open in Camera Raw. It's going to open both of those files into Adobe Camera Raw. And the reason why I show you this is because this is the graphic interface for Adobe Camera Raw. This is what opens up when you open a RAW file into Photoshop. Whether you do that from Windows Explorer or you do that from Adobe Bridge, this is how you get into Adobe Camera Raw. It's basically a program that can't be double-clicked and accessed. Like, you can't just use cameraRaw.exe. There's no such thing. Camera Raw opens when you open a RAW file into Photoshop. So the basic interface, one thing I'm going to show you here is the film strip. So the film strip right now I have on the left-hand side. By default, it might look like this. If we go to film strip orientation horizontal, it might look like this. I don't like my film strip like this because I think it doesn't give me enough access to my image. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to film strip and say vertical. I think in general, this just gives me a better viewing of my photo by having the film strip on the left. You can make the film strip larger and smaller if you'd like, but I think this just gives me a good viewing of what my photo looks like, okay? You notice that even as we pull the film strip all the way over, even at its biggest here, we still get a lot, but if it's down at the bottom, we lose a lot of information in that editing pane. So this is probably the best way to do it. If you just bring in one file, you might not see the film strip. If you want to hide the film strip, you can click the hide film strip button at the bottom, okay? So right here, you have your zoom level. You can go fit in view to make sure it fits in the entire pane of the image, or you can zoom in right here just by clicking at the bottom. I will tell you that in order to get to this magnifying glass, you can also press Control and Spacebar or Command and Spacebar on a Mac. And that's also going to be the hotkey for that if you're in Photoshop. If you say fit in view, after right clicking, we can open up the image again. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about, really critical, is right down here. This is actually your workflow settings. So we're going to talk about some of the other settings in your preferences, but these workflow ones are really important, first of all. So if I click on this down here, you can see right here that what this pops up and it says, what's your color space? It's Adobe RGB 1998 at 16 bits per channel. Now this might actually be defaulted to 8 bits per channel, but this is what happens. This is the handoff from Adobe Camera Raw into Photoshop. So when you send a RAW file from Adobe Camera Raw over to Photoshop, you want to make sure it has the most bits per channel. So you're going to want to make sure you set this to 16 bits per channel. In the space here, I usually use Adobe RGB. I know ProPhoto has a lot more color space involved in it, but it's not as universal as something like Adobe RGB. So I choose Adobe RGB. Here's a perfect example. I just sent a print off to a printing company, and they said, could you please send us a 16-bit TIFF file with Adobe RGB 1998 as your color space? They didn't ask me for ProPhoto. They asked me for Adobe RGB. So in most cases, Adobe RGB is going to be perfect for us. There's a lot more color that's available in a ProPhoto image, but we really don't have the technology right now to be able to keep up with something like ProPhoto. So Adobe RGB 1998 it is at 16 bits per channel. Okay, make sure this is set because that handoff that's going to go to Photoshop is all going to rely on what's happening right here. And press OK. So what we're going to talk about today with Adobe Camera Raw is all these tools here, which are our global tools. And then over here, we're going to talk about some of these tools over here until we get to the brush, the graduated filter, and the radial filter, because these are local tools. So we'll talk about those local tools tomorrow. Before we begin, you might want to look at your preferences for Adobe Camera Raw. So go into your preferences here, go up to General. So what you'll see here is that when this says Edit Panels, your panels basically being a single, responsive, or multi, that details what's happening over here. So as we click these tabs to open this in the new version of Adobe Camera Raw, this is set to single. So if I open up the basic settings and then I open up the curve, it closes the basic settings and opens the curve. I like it that way, but you might want it so that it opens all of them. I don't really like that, but if you do, click multi. What happens here is if you click basic and then your curve, you're gonna get a little scroll bar here that'll allow you to scroll between your curve and your basic. I like to be compartmentalized in a very specific area as I'm editing. So I'm gonna change mine back to single. You're gonna change it to responsive if, say, your monitor is rather small and you wanna make sure that that pane fits into the size of your monitor. So at 1920 by 1080, you really don't need to worry about the responsive slider there. You can just leave that at single, okay? Zoom and pan, you can set it up so that your zoom and pan is like Lightroom. You can set up so you have old legacy shortcuts for the undo shortcuts, Control Z, Control Alt Z, that kind of thing. Or file handling here. This is also kind of important. Now, as far as the JPEG and TIFF handling, I don't really open up JPEGs in Adobe Camera Raw because they don't really need to be opened up in Adobe Camera Raw. I prefer Adobe Camera Raw to be only for RAW files or of the like. So like a TIFF file that has a lot of data in it, I will automatically open any supported TIFF files, but I don't typically open JPEG files. Now up here, when you go to embed XMP in DNG files, this, what I'm working with, is a DNG file. Now, if I was working with one of my Sony ARW files, you might have different options here, but I'm just gonna explain what an XMP sidecar file is. An XMP sidecar file is a little file that sits next to a RAW file. If you're using a DNG, I usually embed mine into the DNG. Now these XMP sidecar files, they don't hurt anything. They're really small. They're only a couple kilobytes a piece, if anything. Basically what it is it's a notepad that gets put next to any individual RAW file that you open up. So I like to have my XMP sidecar files on the side. Some people prefer their XMP sidecar files in the RAW file. I'd actually prefer it on the side. But when I'm working with DNGs, because it's Adobe's digital negative, I typically embed the XMP sidecar file right into that RAW file. If I'm using my Sony A7R files, I have that sidecar file next to the RAW file. It also gives me a good idea of what images have been edited when I go into my Windows Explorer and I see an XMP sidecar file that has the same name as the RAW file next to it. Again, it's basically a notepad. Whatever you do in here is going to be recorded into that XMP sidecar file. This is a DNG, so whatever we do in here is going to be recorded right into that DNG. Going into performance. Now, I have a 6 GB video card, so I like to have my GPU or graphics processing unit set up to be what is doing the heavy lifting for Adobe Camera Raw because it's a fast video card. If you don't have a video card, you have an onboard video card, that might be a little bit slower. So it's going to be based on your machine. Camera Raw cache. I keep my Camera Raw cache on a different hard drive. So I've got several different drives in my computer. I don't like to have that on my C drive because I don't want it to be bogging down my C drive. You can set the size of that cache to be, let's say 2 gigabytes before it dumps or whatever that might be. Or you can purge that cache right here in Adobe Camera Raw rather quickly. If you start to see Adobe Camera Raw moving slowly, it might be a good idea to purge that cache. You can put this wherever you might have ample space. If you don't have ample space, change this to something like 2 gigabytes instead of 5 gigabytes. Your RAW defaults, this is where you can actually set up very individualistic RAW defaults or basically a preset for any given camera RAW file that you have that you bring into Adobe Camera Raw. So Let's say there's certain things that I want done to every RAW file that I bring in for my A7R III camera. I can set that up here. It's pretty powerful stuff. We already talked about these workflow settings, so we'll just go ahead and press OK. So now I'm going to talk about the tools that are in Adobe Camera Raw first before I actually start talking about the global tools here. So these are our global tools, which is a global edit, meaning it happens over the entire photo. And these are our local tools, the adjustment brush, the graduated filter, and the radial filter. But first, I'm going to talk about the crop tool. So right now you can see that the new layout that we have here is actually really awesome. We can see that the edit settings here are all of our global tools. If we go down to the crop tool, it's going to change over to the crop tool. Now, the crop tool here is pretty smart in Adobe Camera Raw in that you can change the aspect ratio to whatever size that you want it to be. If you know that you're going to be printing this as a 5:7, it might not be a bad idea to set this to 5:7 and edit your image. I tend to do all my print cropping in Photoshop, so I wouldn't necessarily do that here. So I'll leave that as shot. But if you want to get a good idea of what it might look like with this printed to a 5:7 or a 4:5 or 8:10 to see how much is going to be cut off of this normal RAW file that's typically going to be more of a 2:3 or 4:6 aspect ratio because it's a full frame image, that would give me a good idea of that at a, let's say 4:6. But I'm gonna go ahead and set that to as shot. One thing here, the angle. This, as you move this, is gonna give you a grid to show you the angle of which we're gonna move the image. And as we move that image, it will also crop in so that all that excess data that we're cropping out is gone. And then we have the data that's there. Now, we don't actually, when we crop something in Adobe Camera Raw, you're not actually losing that data, okay? In Photoshop, you can actually be deleting pixels when you crop it. But in Adobe Camera Raw, it still leaves that outside edge. You can see it here. That's still gonna be there. So at any time when I come in to edit this image, if I don't like the crop, I can just press delete and it goes back to being what it was when I first took the shot, okay? One thing here is the straighten tool. So if I click on the straighten tool, this is a good idea to go ahead and straighten my image, the horizon of my image. So if I want to straighten the horizon of my image, you can see it's a little bit off. I believe the horizon starts where that hill is over on the left, and then over on the right, it ends where the bottom of those trees are. So that may be a better idea for straightening my photograph. Now you could try to use the angle on your own, but when you use the straighten tool, you'll see that the angle already gets set up. So I like that. I'm going to keep that the way that is. Right down here where you see the rotate and flip, sometimes your camera might not record it into the EXIF data as far as what orientation the image was, and you might need to flip and rotate your image right here in Adobe Camera Raw. If we needed to flip it horizontal or vertical, we could do that here. We could flip it so that it flips along the vertical axis, or we can flip it here so it goes along the horizontal axis. Now, you might not need that, but it's there in case you might need it. Let's say you're like, I don't really like the orientation of this road coming in from the left. Let's make it come in from the right. As long as you don't have a stop sign in here, that's okay, because then it would read like pots or something like that. So let's go ahead and flip that back over. The next one down is going to be the spot removal tool. Now, the spot removal tool is an awesome tool. I think it's one of the greatest tools that we have here in Adobe Camera Raw because it can help us see any sensor dust spots that we might have on our image. And one way we can do that is we want to see sensor dust because it's sometimes you can't even tell it's there. We have to click visualize spots on here. And then with visualize spots on, we can move this over. And then we might see up here, like these little circles. I'm gonna press Control and Spacebar to zoom in. These little circles here, these are sensor dust spots. So if I click on this, I've got this set to heal. I'll get into this more in a little bit, but with this set to heal, with a small brush size, about the size of what it is that I want to correct, I'm just gonna click. And then Adobe Camera Raw is automatically gonna move over to another area to fill in that spot. So if I click here, it's gonna tell me it's gonna pull from this area here. Now I can move that to wherever I want by moving the green circle. The red circle is what's gonna go away. The green circle is what we're putting down. If I press the spacebar key, I can then go into the hand tool and kind of move this around. This looks like a sensor dust spot here as well. So I'll click on that and then fix that up with some area around there. Now to get out of the visualized spots, that just gives you a way that you can see those spots that you might have an issue with. But it's not just for fixing sensor dust spots, okay? Let's say down here, I've got these twigs down here that I don't want. This is where we can use this same tool instead of as a spot where we click and fix it. We can also click and drag to fix a whole area, okay? So if I wanted to fix this little spot right here, I could click on it and it's gonna grab this area over here to fill that in. With this set to heal, what it's gonna do is it's going to look at the pixels that are in the circle that I wanted to fix, and it's gonna grab from the other one and replace it. and it's going to take those pixels and it's going to try to maintain the same color. How this works is, let's say I wanted to fix this rock over here in the green grass. Okay, I'll click on that. It's going to grab from another green grass area. But watch what happens if I move over here and say, just fill it in with something like this. Well, it's going to assess the colored pixels around it, and it's going to heal it as such. If this is set to clone, watch what happens. It takes an actual physical representation of this area here that I wanted to grab and pulls it over here. This is also a great opportunity to talk about the feather. Right now, this is being feathered in so that the pixels at the edge of that circle start to feather into the center to make a better blend. But if I bring this down and we don't have a feather there, it becomes a whole circle with no feathered edge, okay? So we don't necessarily want that. We want a slight feather so that things blend in. The opacity is how much, when we replace that, is it going to be replaced with? What's the opacity of it? Do we want to get rid of it all the way or just a little bit, okay? Let's change this to heal. And with heal, we're going to bring the feather up because it tends to blend in very nicely. I'm going to go and grab the piece of grass from up here because that's actually more where it should be anyway. If we want to change the size of this brush, we can just click on the outside of that and make that a little bit smaller even after we've made the selection for it, okay? So one of the things I'm going to do here is I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller. I'm going to click right here and just drag on over to show you that you can replace a whole section without having to go into each individual little spot. And that fixes that up right there too, okay? So that's pretty good. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to take your time with your homework and fix all the little twigs that you see in this image. That's what you're going to do with the rest of your time today, along with some of the other global tools that I'm going to show you. Now, this adjustment brush, local brush, I'll show that tomorrow. Graduated filter, local brush, show that to you tomorrow. Same with the radial filter. This right here, the red eye reduction, I can honestly tell you, I have never once used the red eye or pet eye reduction. Typically, that would be if you had a flash and you get red eye in someone's eye. This is what you could use to fix that. I've never seen an issue where I needed to use that, but I don't often use a flash either or do portrait photography. If you did, this would be how you fix it. It's pretty self-explanatory. When you look at the pupil size, you just click on where it is that you want to fix, and it does a pretty good job of fixing that for you. Now, snapshots, we'll talk about that towards the end. Presets, we'll talk about that towards the end as well. Down here, you're going to see a hand tool. I don't typically use the hand tool as like going over here and clicking on it. If I want to use the hand tool, I usually just press and hold spacebar, which just gets me the hand tool by using a hotkey. This is a color point sampler where we can click on a color and it tells us in this blue area, you have 110 is your red pixel value, 128 is your green pixel value, and 160 is your blue pixel value. So that blue pixel is actually made up of 3 different colors, which we'll talk about that towards the end of this lesson, quite extensively actually. If you want to get out of this view, just go ahead and click on Close Sample. Right here we have a grid view. So you can change the size of this grid to make it a really small grid or a really large grid. And this can help you when you're trying to make sure that you have a nice straight horizon line, or if you're working with architectural images and you want to make sure that straight lines are straight, vertical lines vertical, horizontal horizontal, so on and so forth, okay? The opacity of that can be changed by moving this up and down. I think a lowered opacity is typically better for this, and that looks pretty good just like that. We can change our grid. We don't necessarily need a grid for this image because it's not an architectural photo and there's a lot of organic shaped things and there really isn't any straight lines in here, okay? So now we can get up to our global tools. So let's talk about these other 2 that are lingering around. Convert and save selected image. If we wanted to save this image, we'd click this button and that would allow us to save this as a DNG. We can save it as a JPEG file. You can create your own presets for this. This is pretty self-explanatory and straightforward. You can change the name of whatever you want to save this as and what folder you want to save that into. Another quick way that you can save the image now is to actually right-click on the image. And then from there, you can go save image and you can quickly save it as a DNG file or a JPEG file, or use any of those presets that you might have already saved in that save image dialog. You have access to them right here. Very, very useful for speeding up how you save an image in Adobe Camera Raw. This used to be a lot more difficult in prior versions. You'd have to click on the file, then click on this little small box down here that said save image or save images. It's much easier, much faster now with the way they've done that. This is a little toggle full screen mode where you can toggle full screen or non-full screen. I would always say work in Adobe Camera Raw as a full screen image anyway. It's just going to overall look a lot better. All right, so now let's go ahead and dive into our global tools. And we'll start that by clicking on the Edit tab here, which is our basic settings. What I want you to realize though, is that if you look over here, see these little teeny tiny dots right there? That tells us that we did something in our crop tool and we did something in our spot removal tool. Pretty cool, huh? So we go over to our edits. Once we get some edits done in here, it'll show a little dot next to the edits as well. So let's go ahead and get rid of this grid up here, and then we'll fit this on screen. So right click, fit and view. Thanks for watching this part of the 30 Days to Photoshop Mastery course. If you like this, there is plenty more in the 30 Days to Photoshop Mastery course. You can find that in the card above and in the link below. And if you want to watch the other parts to this little mini series that I've pulled from the 30 Days to Photoshop Mastery course, you can look in the description below and navigate to each individual part for quick access. I do hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot from it, and I hope it made the new Adobe Camera Raw a little bit easier for you. Thank you for taking time to watch this. I sincerely appreciate it.